The air was thick with frost. January 1943. In the barren wasteland of the Soviet Union, the landscape seemed to hold its breath as the sun barely broke through a gray sky. Beneath the pale light, the earth trembled with the rumble of massive engines. A squadron of Soviet T-34 tanks, their steel hulls caked with mud and soot, slowly rolled into position. Each tank, a symbol of Soviet resolve, was poised for battle. Yet one man inside this metal behemoth would soon turn the tide in a way no one could have predicted. Lieutenant Alexei Petrov sat inside his tank, eyes steely with determination. To his crew, he was an enigma, his methods unconventional, his orders seemingly illogical. They had heard the whispers, the backwards loader. Yet in that moment, the skepticism of his comrades would fade into disbelief. As the distant sound of enemy engines reached their ears, a formation of German Panzers emerged from the fog. Their guns pointed menacingly at the Soviet lines. Petrov's hands tightened on the controls. He knew this battle would either make or break him. But his mind was calm. He had one advantage. His tank loaded in a way no one had dared to try before. And soon the world would see he was not wrong. The year 1943 marked a pivotal point in the brutal conflict that was the Eastern Front of World War II. The German Wehrmacht had, for over 2 years, pushed deep into Soviet territory, advancing on key cities like Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow. However, despite initial successes, the relentless Soviet resistance had begun to turn the tide. By the winter of 1943, the Wehrmacht found itself fighting not just a war of attrition, but one against the fierce, unyielding will of the Soviet people. The stage for our story was set in the cold, snow-choked fields of the Soviet Union. The German forces, despite their earlier dominance, were now stretched thin across a vast front. The tide had begun to shift. On January 12, 1943, the Soviet Red Army launched an all-out counteroffensive near Stalingrad, encircling the German Sixth Army. The Germans were on the back foot, but they would not relent easily. In the cold Russian winter, it was the battle of tanks, infantry, and artillery that would decide who would control the fate of this war. The tank, a relatively new weapon of war, had proven to be a game-changer on the battlefield. The Germans had the advantage with their mighty Panzers, particularly the fearsome Panzer III and Panzer IV. These tanks, with their powerful cannons and armor, were the backbone of the German armored divisions. Yet the Soviets, though behind in terms of technological sophistication, had their own answer, the T-34. A workhorse of war, the T-34 was widely regarded as the most effective tank on the battlefield due to its sloped armor, mobility, and powerful 76mm gun. Yet the Soviet forces were not as experienced in tank warfare as their German counterparts. Their doctrine was often one of mass, overwhelming force, a tactic that, while effective at times, was not always efficient. They were constantly adapting and learning from the brutal experiences of battle. It was in this environment, amidst the chaos of war, that Lieutenant Alexei Petrov found himself. Petrov was a career officer, known for his deep understanding of tank mechanics and battlefield strategy. However, his methods were unconventional, to say the least. While his fellow officers were focused on traditional tank tactics, lining up their tanks for optimal firepower, Petrov had begun experimenting with a unique, counterintuitive approach to loading and preparing his T-34 for combat. His method was seen by most of his comrades as backward, risky, and, frankly, foolish. But Petrov believed in the importance of efficiency, and his approach was grounded in an understanding of his tank's capabilities. What Petrov had noticed was that the usual method of loading the tanks, placing the rounds in an orderly, predictable manner in the main compartment, created unnecessary delays during reloading. In the chaos of battle, seconds counted. A delayed reload could mean the difference between life and death. So, Petrov devised a method that would allow his crew to load the tank faster by reversing the traditional positioning of the ammunition. The rounds would be stacked differently, and the loader's position would be adjusted for speed and efficiency. While others mocked him, calling his tactic backwards, Petrov saw it as the key to gaining the upper hand in battle. And as the war dragged on, it became clear that the Soviet forces had no choice but to innovate and adapt rapidly if they were to overcome the German might. At the heart of the Soviet armored force was the T-34, a tank that would become synonymous with Soviet resilience. It was an excellent design for its time, combining mobility, armor, and firepower into a formidable weapon. The T-34's sloped armor made it more resistant to enemy shells, while its wide tracks allowed it to navigate the harsh Russian terrain with relative ease, a distinct advantage in the muddy and snow-covered landscapes. Its 76mm gun, though smaller than the German 88mm, was more than sufficient to penetrate the armor of most German tanks, especially when fired at close range. However, despite its technical prowess, the T-34 was not without its flaws. The lack of a coordinated strategy and the relatively inexperienced Soviet tank crews often made the difference in combat. The Germans had perfected the art of tank warfare, employing tactics like the blitzkrieg strategy, rapid, concentrated assaults that overwhelmed the enemy through speed and shock. The Germans had learned the importance of coordination between their tanks, infantry, and air support, while the Soviets were still developing these techniques. It was against this backdrop of evolving tactics and technology that Petrov's unorthodox methods would come to the fore. In tank warfare, where every second counted, any advantage could make the difference between life and death. The battlefield was unforgiving, fast-moving, unpredictable, and brutal. The Soviet forces needed every edge they could get, even if it meant challenging conventional wisdom. In early January 1943, as the temperature plummeted and the war raged on, Petrov's unit found itself positioned in the path of a formidable German armored division. The enemy, led by experienced commanders and with a superior number of Panzers, was intent on breaking through Soviet lines. The engagement seemed doomed from the outset, yet Petrov believed his tank could make a difference. But before the battle could unfold, there was still one final obstacle: gaining the trust of his men. His crew, skeptical of his methods, were about to face the ultimate test of their lives. Would Petrov's backwards tank loading prove to be the key to victory, or would it lead them to disaster? Lieutenant Alexei Petrov was not a man of grandiose words. He was quiet, analytical, and, most importantly, persistent. In an army where tradition ran deep and experience was revered above all else, Petrov's unorthodox methods had initially drawn skepticism from his fellow officers. The whispers about his backwards tank loading were harsh, and many of his comrades believed it was a fool's gamble, a strategy that, if anything, would get them killed. In the unforgiving world of Soviet tank warfare, soldiers could expect little in the way of praise. For the men in Petrov's crew, it was no different. Tank crews lived in a world where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. If one member faltered, the entire team was at risk. The crew's loyalty to their officer was always at stake. In such circumstances, trust was everything. Petrov understood this, and though he was often ridiculed, he never lost his composure. As the Soviet winter froze the landscape, his men became increasingly wary of the backwards loading technique. "It's a death sentence," one of the tankers remarked as they prepared for battle. Petrov, in his quiet way, reassured them. He wasn't a man for speeches, but he was a man of results. He trusted his system, and soon so would they. The crew's nerves were taut as they readied themselves for combat. But Petrov's calm demeanor was contagious. His men saw it in the way he moved, in the way he never panicked. The cold, biting air seemed to still when Petrov gave the order to load their T-34 in his peculiar way. For a moment, even his most vocal critics hesitated, but Petrov never wavered. For them, the first shot fired from the tank would be the turning point. Would it be a triumph or a disaster? Would Petrov's strategy prove sound? Or would they be left wishing they had followed tradition? From a tactical standpoint, what Petrov proposed was nothing short of revolutionary. The standard practice in Soviet tank crews was to stack ammunition in a predictable, highly organized fashion. This method, while efficient under normal circumstances, slowed down the crew during moments of intense combat. In the heat of battle, every second was precious, especially when facing the fearsome German Panzers, whose superior firepower and armor could quickly overwhelm the Soviets. Petrov realized that the traditional method wasn't practical in the field. While standard loading techniques focused on keeping rounds organized and easily accessible, they did so at the cost of speed. He understood that the key to survival lay in minimizing the time it took to reload the gun. By reversing the loading order and shifting the position of the loader, Petrov believed he could cut the reloading time in half, enabling his crew to fire with rapid precision and take advantage of fleeting opportunities. But it was more than just about speed. Petrov's approach to tank loading was also a matter of balance and efficiency. The rear of the tank, where the crew usually stacked ammunition, was often the most cramped and difficult to navigate. Petrov's unorthodox method sought to balance the tank's cramped interior with the need for quick action. The placement of the rounds ensured that the loader could swiftly reach the next shell, without having to contort into uncomfortable positions or risk fumbling under pressure. Though others saw it as reckless, Petrov's method was grounded in a practical understanding of combat's chaotic nature. As the German Panzers approached, Petrov's crew would soon realize that his gamble was paying off. The T-34, while an exceptional tank for its time, was not without its drawbacks. It was, after all, a mass-production vehicle built with speed and efficiency in mind, not perfection. The gun was powerful, but not as potent as the German 88mm cannon mounted on the Panzer IV. The armor was sloped, but it had its weak spots, and the tank's engine, while reliable, was prone to breakdowns in the harsh winter conditions. Yet, the T-34 had one undeniable advantage: its maneuverability. The wide tracks allowed it to navigate the treacherous Soviet terrain with ease, while its compact design made it harder to hit than the bulkier German Panzers. In the hands of a skilled crew, it could deliver devastating firepower with speed and precision. But the success of the T-34 was heavily dependent on the crews who operated it. The tank was only as effective as its crew's ability to work together under pressure. This is where Petrov's leadership became essential. His ability to adapt to the tank's strengths and counteract its weaknesses was a pivotal factor in their success. By using the backwards loading technique, Petrov was making the most of the T-34's design. The faster the crew could load, the quicker they could maneuver, and the more effective they would be against the German armor. What might have seemed like a foolhardy risk was, in fact, a calculated move designed to take full advantage of the T-34's mobility and firepower. The key to Petrov's unorthodox approach was his ability to lead. While many officers would have been content to follow the established methods, Petrov recognized that victory would require more than just routine tactics. His willingness to challenge the status quo, even at the risk of his reputation, set him apart from the conventional commanders around him. As the Soviet forces prepared to face the German tanks, Petrov knew that his decision to use the backwards loading technique would either elevate him to hero status or condemn him as a fool. He wasn't just relying on his own judgment, but also on the trust of his crew. In tank warfare, a commander could not succeed without the cooperation and respect of his men. Petrov's calm under pressure, coupled with his willingness to break away from tradition, made him a leader worth following. When the first rounds from their tank tore into the German Panzers, Petrov's men knew that their officer had been right. The crew, initially skeptical, now understood the logic behind his approach. The backwards loading wasn't just a trick. It was a game-changing tactic, one that allowed them to fire more quickly and respond more decisively to the ever-changing flow of the battle. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of noise, movement, and destruction. The distant thunder of German artillery reverberated through the frozen earth, mixing with the sharp staccato of Soviet machine guns and the deep, terrifying growl of German panzers advancing through the snow. The sky was a dull, unforgiving gray, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of burning fuel and oil. Petrov's T-34 sat low in its position, hidden behind a ridge of snow and debris. His crew was tense but focused, their hands steady despite the nerves that would have rattled most men in the face of the massive German armored division approaching. The Panzers, numbering over a dozen, were a menacing sight, sleek, powerful, and lethal. Their 75mm guns could tear through a Soviet tank like paper, and their advanced optics gave them an edge in range and accuracy. But Petrov had one thing the Germans didn't: speed. As the first Panzer rounded a bend, Petrov issued a calm command over the intercom. "Ready the gun. Get the shells loaded." His voice was steady, his mind sharp. His crew, now fully understanding the efficiency of his unorthodox, backwards loading technique, went into action with practiced precision. The loader moved swiftly, pulling shells from their reversed positions and feeding them into the breech. Within moments, the T-34's 76mm gun was locked and loaded. Without warning, Petrov fired. The shell tore through the air and slammed into the side of a German Panzer, striking its weak side armor where the sloped design couldn't deflect the impact. The first Panzer exploded in a cloud of fire and smoke. It was a devastating blow, but more importantly, it was the first real test of Petrov's method in action. The speed at which the crew had reloaded and fired left the German tankers stunned. They hadn't even realized they were under attack until it was too late. Petrov's crew, now confident in their technique, prepared for the next strike. The German response was swift. A second Panzer roared forward, its turret swinging toward Petrov's T-34. But the Soviet tank had already shifted position, its crew anticipating the move. The loader worked with incredible speed, and once again Petrov fired, this time hitting the Panzer's tracks, disabling it. The German tankers bailed out as their vehicle became an inferno. The battlefield was no longer just a place of combat. It was a proving ground. Petrov's crew, once doubtful, now saw the merit of their officers' approach. The backwards loading had given them a rapid response capability that was more than a match for the German Panzers. As the engagement unfolded, Petrov's crew systematically tore through the German formation, using the T-34's speed and Petrov's calculated, quick-fire strategy to devastating effect. The third Panzer met the same fate as the first two, its turret disabled and its engine ignited by a well-placed shot from Petrov's gun. In less than 15 minutes, 3 of the most feared tanks in the German arsenal had been neutralized. But the Germans weren't done. Their commanders, realizing that they were losing ground, ordered a full retreat. But it wasn't just the damage to their tanks that forced the withdrawal. It was the shock, the realization that Soviet tanks under Petrov's leadership could now fight back with precision and speed. They had underestimated the Soviets, assuming they were stuck in outdated tactics. Petrov had proven them wrong, and the psychological impact of his actions was undeniable. The battle, though small in the context of the broader war, was a turning point for the Soviet forces. The German tanks, for the first time, had been forced to retreat under fire from what they considered an inferior foe. Petrov's unconventional tactics had demonstrated that even the mightiest of enemies could be defeated by a combination of speed, strategy, and unyielding resolve. For Petrov and his crew, the victory was bittersweet. The loss of their comrades in other tanks weighed heavily on them, but they also knew they had made a difference. They had not only destroyed 3 of the German Panzers, they had broken through the mental barrier that the German forces had built around their own invincibility. The reputation of Petrov's backwards loading method began to spread quickly. Soviet commanders, initially skeptical, started to take notice. Soon, Petrov's tactics were being studied, and in the weeks that followed, they were adopted by other tank units. What had been mocked as a foolish idea was now recognized as a masterstroke of battlefield ingenuity. Petrov, once an officer relegated to the shadows of traditional thinking, had proven himself. The skepticism and ridicule he had faced from his fellow officers were now replaced with respect and admiration. His reputation, forged in the fire of battle, would forever be linked to that fateful day when his backwards loading method destroyed 3 German Panzers in the span of minutes. The momentum of the battle had shifted. What had seemed like a long shot for Soviet forces was now a clear advantage. The German forces, shaken by the unexpected and rapid destruction of their tanks, would no longer take Soviet armored divisions lightly. The tide of war on the Eastern Front had begun to turn, and Petrov's role in that shift would be remembered for years to come. The German retreat that followed Petrov's decisive action was not just a tactical withdrawal. It was a psychological blow. 3 Panzers, some of the most formidable tanks in the world, had been destroyed in a matter of minutes by a Soviet T-34. A victory like this on the Eastern Front was rare and precious. The Soviet forces, already weary from years of grinding conflict, had something to rally behind, proof that their tanks, their tactics, and their resilience could outmatch the seemingly indomitable German war machine. The immediate aftermath of the engagement saw a ripple effect throughout the Soviet ranks. Commanders, who had once been hesitant to adopt Petrov's unconventional methods, were now curious. The victory was clear proof that new thinking, even if it went against tradition, could yield tangible results. Petrov's backwards loading technique was no longer viewed as a quirky anomaly, it was a tactical breakthrough. The shift in strategy did not happen overnight, but the seeds had been planted. Soviet tank commanders began to experiment with Petrov's method in subsequent engagements, and many of them, to their surprise, found it effective. The increased speed of reloading meant that Soviet tanks could engage German tanks faster and more efficiently, breaking the German momentum in ways that hadn't been possible before. Petrov had shown that Soviet tanks, often outgunned and outnumbered, could still fight with the same decisiveness as the Germans if given the right tools and leadership. For Petrov's crew, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had survived one of the most intense battles of their careers, but they had lost comrades along the way. The victory was important, but the cost of war weighed heavily on them. Still, they understood that their actions had not only saved lives in that moment, they had changed the course of the battle. They had proved that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, innovation and courage could tip the scales. As the Soviet forces regrouped and the Panzers retreated, the impact of the battle echoed far beyond the immediate area. In the months that followed, Soviet tank units, now more confident in their abilities, began to press the Germans harder than ever before. The momentum of the war had shifted. The Soviet offensive was beginning to gain traction, and the German forces, once so sure of their superiority, found themselves on the defensive. The long-term impact of Petrov's victory stretched far beyond that single battle. What was once seen as a peculiar, reckless gamble had now become a core lesson in Soviet tank doctrine. Petrov's backwards loading method, though still unconventional in some circles, was formally incorporated into the Soviet military strategy for tank operations. Soviet tank crews, once reliant on traditional methods of loading and positioning, now had a faster, more efficient technique to use under fire. Petrov's success also marked a critical shift in the way Soviet commanders viewed innovation. In the early years of the war, the Red Army had often relied on sheer numbers to compensate for their technological shortcomings. The T-34, despite being an excellent tank, had suffered from undertrained crews and inconsistent tactics. But after Petrov's victory, Soviet tank commanders began to realize that their greatest asset was not just their tanks, but their ability to adapt and think creatively on the battlefield. Petrov's example would serve as a catalyst for further innovation in Soviet armored warfare. On the German side, the loss of 3 Panzers in such a short time frame had a profound effect on morale. The Germans had long believed in the invincibility of their tanks, and the sight of their most prized assets being destroyed by a seemingly inferior foe was a humiliating blow. The defeat also demonstrated the increasing difficulty the Germans faced as the war on the Eastern Front wore on. Their own tanks, though superior in terms of firepower and armor, could no longer be guaranteed to win the day. The shift in tank tactics by the Soviets, coupled with the mounting pressure of the Soviet counteroffensive, would eventually lead to the German retreat from Stalingrad, a monumental turning point in the war. Petrov's victory, while not a singular moment that ended the war, was nonetheless part of the larger shift in the Eastern Front's trajectory. It signaled to the world that Soviet forces were no longer content to be outclassed by the German war machine. The Soviets were learning, adapting, and evolving at a rapid pace. The Germans, on the other hand, were becoming increasingly overextended and out of sync with the changing dynamics of modern warfare. In the broader context of the war, Petrov's battle was a microcosm of the larger struggle. It was a battle of attrition, where innovation, courage, and adaptability began to win out over brute strength and outdated strategies. It was the story of how, against all odds, a small but significant victory on the Eastern Front changed the perception of Soviet tank crews and proved that ingenuity could rival even the most advanced technology. In the cold, endless expanse of the Soviet steppes, where death and destruction had become daily companions, Petrov's victory stands as a reminder of the human spirit's capacity for adaptation, ingenuity, and resolve. The war was not won by sheer force of arms alone, but by the ability of soldiers and commanders to think outside the box, sometimes in ways that defied convention, even ridicule. Petrov's backwards tank loading, initially mocked and misunderstood, embodied the essence of innovation under pressure. War is often described as a contest of brute strength, but it is also a struggle of intellect, of the ability to overcome the limitations of technology and environment through sheer willpower. Petrov's small but decisive triumph is a testament to this. He wasn't merely challenging the tactical norms of his time, he was challenging the very idea of what was possible in tank warfare. In that moment, when the first Panzer exploded under the fire of a Soviet T-34, a new chapter was written in the history of warfare. It's easy to focus on the tangible results of such a victory, the destruction of enemy tanks, the shift in battle momentum. But Petrov's true legacy is more subtle. It lies in the reminder that innovation often comes from the most unexpected places, and that leaders must be willing to stand alone, to risk failure, in order to uncover new paths to success. Petrov's decision to embrace what seemed like a foolish idea transformed the tide of the battle and, in turn, the broader course of the war. For his crew, and for Soviet tank commanders in the years that followed, the lesson was clear. The battlefield rewards those who dare to think differently, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Petrov's victory wasn't just a military success. It was a symbol of how resilience, adaptability, and creative problem-solving could outwit even the most advanced technology of the time. And so, as the war raged on, Petrov's name became synonymous with tactical brilliance. A quiet, unassuming officer who had turned the tides of history with a single, daring decision. In the end, his victory was not just about the destruction of enemy tanks, but about the breaking of the mental and strategic barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. For history, the lesson is clear. Victory often comes not from following tradition, but from the courage to challenge it. Petrov's moment on the battlefield, though only a small piece of the greater conflict, illuminated a timeless truth. In war, as in life, the greatest victories come from the boldest ideas.